let's start with the minister first to see a little bit about your views about how you can see the trade policy, the cross-border trade, to reduce, and how you can reduce as a government side the fragmentation to change the world or change the views of the more resilient logistics corridor, especially in emerging economies like yours.
So thank you for the opportunity to be here at this wonderfully organized event, to be able to engage with governments, with businesses, all in the area of advancing our mutual interests. So first of all, the first point I want to get across is that in today's global political landscape, I think the only thing that is predictable is unpredictability. And that is a fact that we have to face and that we have to learn to live with. Whether it's issues of a political nature, whether it's security challenges that exist. And we have to face these challenges head on by not being purely reactive to them, but also being adaptive from a long-term perspective. And that is why I believe, especially coming from the position of government, I strongly believe that diversification is the key risk management tool that exists. And that means not being exclusively dependent or reliant on one industry, not being exclusively dependent on or betting exclusively on one route, one market, one hub. We need to engage when it comes to diversifying our options, and we also need to engage more often with one another, especially with markets and with industries that we didn't interpret as being conventional to us in recent periods. And I think this is the approach that governments need to take, and governments need to engage and talk with each other more often, and they need to be quicker when the challenges exist. I think that for many years, the status quo was that there was this landscape that existed, there was this system that existed, and we could sail through it by not adapting very often. Now we must learn that adaptation to challenges must be very quick and very efficient, and that is the tool that we must use to our advantage.
And that is interesting because, of course, as we discussed before, we have all of the difficulties sometimes to do business in Europe itself because of the regulation approach. And I think your views are completely different in terms of how we can make that happen in a faster way, in the productive way as well for your country.
So of course, I think that the challenge that we're facing within Europe, and here I don't exclusively mean just the European Union, but Europe as a continent, including nations that are not members of the European Union, is a hyperinflation of legislation. And I always talk about this. Everything is overregulated. Businesses want streamlined procedures. They want everything to be efficient and to be quick. And a great example of a nation that does this perfectly is the United Arab Emirates.
Exactly.
And these are lessons that we need to learn. And it's not just about using tools, including artificial intelligence, when it comes to both administrative procedures, but it's also about making legislation that is adaptive and prepared for business. And it is also about using tools that we as a government are, that include government-to-government partnerships where nations can work together to help business be successful.
Yeah. And let's turn now to Mr. Tarek. The company, the name of the company already tells us agility and the agility to make business happen. That's why I'm quite impressed about the growth of the company in the last few years. And I think there is some interesting flows that you are exploring in emerging markets that is very interesting to look at that, Asia, Latin America, Asia and Africa, emerging countries. Let's say, how you see this reshaping the logistics around the world, and from your perspective, what is the weakness of the global logistics, and basically how you coordinate in terms of to have more resilience and advanced economies in the world, and how we can link the north, south corridors, let's say.
So thank you for that kind introduction. I think the first highlight and takeaway is that this area of volatility is something that's become structural. Something that's no longer cyclical. It's something that we have to learn to adapt and live with. I think since 2020, there have been over 18,000 new tariffs and trade restrictions introduced in global trade. A lot of those were attributed to COVID, and the way I would think about it, the special interests kind of used COVID as a way to get new trade restrictions introduced that benefited local or private, I would say, players in certain economies. I would also argue that, in the years leading up to 2020, there was a pretty strong anti-globalization movement that kind of facilitated, made it easier for governments to introduce these 18,000 new trade restrictions. Obviously, today, we're talking about an even more complex environment where you have the US government with a new view towards how global trade should be managed to benefit, I would say, more local and domestic political concerns. And we're also seeing that these geopolitical events are becoming structural as well. We have Russia, we have China and US decoupling, we have the Red Sea issue. These are issues that are increasingly becoming norms in the way that we have to look at the supply chain and the business world. To make things even more difficult, and this is the really tough one for me, is that for the last 50 years, we were focused on globalization and we were focused on optimizing costs through offshoring and through globalization. That determination, that focus on cost actually really hurt us when it came time to looking for a more resilient supply chain. So we spent 50 years trying to reduce costs and benefit from comparative economics. And then along comes COVID, along comes these tariffs, and everybody wakes up and says, hey, our supply chains are not resilient. Well, yeah, they're definitely not resilient. They might have been cost effective for a certain point in time, but they're not designed for the new paradigm. So we're playing catch up now. I think I would add that another, I would say, complexity is that governments have become more adept at using digitization and AI to actually make these 18,000 tariffs and I would say trade restrictions more effective. So in the past, the government might introduce a trade restriction, nobody would pay attention. Today, it's digitally encoded. It means things have to work in that way. So those 18,000, I would say, new trade restrictions are being empowered by AI and digitization, which makes our job really much more complex. So what are the strategies to deal with it? I'll briefly talk about three. I think we need to double down on globalization. With all that we've heard about tariffs and trade wars, 72% of global trade is still taking place based on WTO rules and regulations. So I think that's one takeaway, is that we need to double down and continue down the path, but keep open this idea that we need to optimize costs, but also increase resiliency at the same time. We need to heavily invest in multimodal infrastructure. You can see the government here, the government in Saudi Arabia, they've invested in railroads, multimodal architectures to actually prepare themselves for future, I would say, shocks to the system. So they have the flexibility to respond. And then I think it's important that obviously we need to adopt digitization AI. It's being used maybe in certain aspects to disadvantage global trade, but it's up to us in the private sector to actually figure out how to use it to an advantage. I would say the last point is to look at this as an opportunity. If you were to speak to traders in the dealing room at Goldman Sachs and you tell them, okay, next year it's going to be more volatile than last year, they'd be very happy. And I think we have to think, think the same way. If you look at the land bridge railroad from the kingdom, they had planned 10 years ago to put this train. It never really materialized. But now it's happening. Why is it happening? It's happening because of what happened in the Red Sea. So that geopolitical event actually, you might, I'm saying this jokingly, but you might have to give the Houthis some founding shares in that project because of that geopolitical problem, you have now a train that's actually re-engineering the way supply chains work. Thank you.
And that's the case. Sometimes when you have the difficulties, you need to push towards solutions, and especially in a globalized world, it's more important that you find the solutions as soon as possible, and I think that is the good takeaway that you mentioned. I have 2 more questions. Please, we need to go a little bit quick. In terms of your country, North Macedonia, you are a landlocked country. You need a lot of, to make the trade happen in your country, you need to be connected. I know very well about what you're doing in your airport, but tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in North Macedonia to make that place a good and connected place to regional integration and to develop the social and competitiveness of the country as well.
So fully in line with what we were speaking about, the complexities of supply chains, the challenges that exist when it comes to logistics, and there are many, and there are future risks that we have to be prepared to anticipate. One of the things that our government has understood very well is that we need to invest in connectivity. First of all, when it comes to rail and road infrastructure. That is why our key priority as a government right now is further investment in both Corridor 8 and Corridor 10. Corridor 8 is a key political security corridor that essentially runs from Italy through the Adriatic and Ionian to Albania, North Macedonia, and from Bulgaria to the Black Sea. And Corridor 10 is a key trade and infrastructure corridor that runs from Hungary to Serbia to North Macedonia to the ports of Thessaloniki and Piraeus. What is specific about our country is that we are the only nation in the region where corridors 8 and 10 intersect. We also understand very well that we need to engage and invest in energy security and connectivity. That is why we are currently building an interconnector with Greece that will give us access to the LNG flowing from the port of Alexandroupolis. But also we are now in the final phase of preparing a government investment in an interconnector with Serbia to have that LNG not just flowing to us, but also flowing through us. That is why when it comes to connectivity, whether it is energy, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is investment in airport and airline infrastructure, and by that I mean in opening up new routes. What is important is diversification, and what is important is understanding your place in the world, your place in the continent where you are, and also what the markets need. And from that perspective, I think we have a very clear approach as a government, and I think that these investments will be very important for the long-term future of our country.
Fantastic, very good examples indeed. Final question now to Mr. Tarek. I think it's important, you mentioned a little bit about the digital platforms, green supply chain solutions, you name it, How do you see the technology, data integration, sustainability commitments let's say, the reshaping the future of the multimodal and logistic approach in the world?
So technology, sustainability, and logistics are all converging. And I think it's important to think of these opportunities in that context. If you take first technology, I think digital, think of the digital aspect as being the plumbing that you need to run AI. That's largely in place, I think, in many places. So we're primed now for governments and private sectors to start using AI because of all the investments that took place in digitizing their platforms. I think also, if you look at the WTO, they believe that AI will augment world exports by up to 40% over the next few years. That's a huge number, okay? And so anybody that is basically discounting AI, if you just look at that number alone, that's going to tell you you need to be spending a good amount of time on that. I would say government of the UAE has announced a plan to release 1 million agents. I think it's this year. So it gives you an idea of how fast the pace is taking place with AI. If you look at McKinsey estimates that in the supply chain and logistics industry, you could have up to $300 billion of value being created just by the adoption of AI. That's only one industry. You can imagine as that kind of reflects into other industries. So clearly technology is important. The environment, the WEF estimates that up to 10 to 15% of emissions in the freight industry could be cut using AI. But then many of you are saying, well, okay, but AI is going to consume a lot of electricity, right? And we're going to have to, consume a lot of hydrocarbons to create the electricity needed for these new platforms. That's true, but there are also technologies out there. Then we announced one partnership today with the government of Abu Dhabi, an AI technology that fits into a data center environment that cuts the power consumption by 40%. So, the technology is part of this. It's part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution. I would say the last part is logistics architecture has become asset light, and that requires, by definition, much stronger governance in the way that the stakeholders interact. That's where the government has a very important role in being a regulator. And the type of regulators we need today are engineers, they're PhDs. It's a different sort of regulator we have. And if you have those regulators, and I've seen this in action in the UAE, those sorts of regulators can get the most out of all of those opportunities. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a really fascinating topic. We can spend the whole afternoon talking. A big applause for the Minister Timčo and Mr. Tarek as well. Thank you very much for your presence.